Ethical principles in pedagogical documentation. Ensuring children's rights during the learning process involves understanding and respecting that children have their view of the world, which may differ from other children and adults. The early childhood educator needs to allow children to make decisions, express their availability, or express views on the reality they observe. It also involves what we previously discussed as children's participation. The ethical principles in pedagogical documentation must be understood by all participants in the educational process, such as parents, educators, children, and others, and emerge from a perspective of holistic assessment. A holistic assessment is an assessment process that considers the child as a whole, considering not only their learning and skills, but also their abilities, interests, and personal, emotional, social, and physical characteristics. Before we move on to the ethical issues that should be considered, we challenge you to think about 5 ethical questions you have in mind with your children. Please share your questions by creating a topic with our colleagues and try to reflect on that. According to Oliveira Formosinho, et al. 6 ethical principles should be taken into account in the pedagogical documentation process. Follow the philosophical principle of the greater good for all participants. Actively and democratically involve children and families in the processes. Respect and consider the holistic learning of the child without forgetting their interaction with professional learning. Consider the contexts as well as the processes and outcomes. Support the individual development process of each child without neglecting the group. Document considering the records of each child or group. Following the philosophical principle of the greater good for all participants involves looking at the child as a competent being with rights. It also involves thinking about families and the rights and support they should receive. The early childhood educator must contribute to holistic learning, seeing the child within a pedagogical, social, and cultural context. They must understand that there is a connection between the well-being of children and families. The documentation process should not be solely the responsibility of the early childhood educator, but rather a sharing between the child's vision, the educator, and families. The assessments present in the documentation should not harm the child or focus on the negative aspects and difficulties of the child, but rather help understand the child in action. It should demonstrate the child is competent. Assessment should consider and respect the holistic learning of the child. It is the educator's role to discover and understand the ways in which the child gives meaning to their experiences. The assessment they develop should focus on what the child does, and not on what they are unable to do, what the child feels, and what they learn. Considering the contexts, processes, and results of documentation implies that the educator situates themselves both in pedagogical praxis and in the child's circumstances, identities, contexts, and cultures. Documentation and assessment involve the appreciation of all the ecological dimensions mentioned. Supporting the individual development process of each child should not invalidate the development of children as a group. Thus, the educator must support each child in developing their possibilities and be aware of their interests in situations. It involves respecting the child's decision to participate or not, and if they choose to participate, the educator should create purposes and encourage the child to use their skills alone or in cooperation. Considering the records of the child and the group for documentation allows the educator to see and review the children's learning processes and become aware of these processes. It allows them to understand them as builders of knowledge and ethics. This implies that the assessment is shaped by the child's motivations, interests, and actions in connectivity with the actions of the educators. It rejects the view of merely predetermined, decontextualized, and imposed programs by the educator. Speaking of ethics in documentation involves speaking of children's rights. By using pedagogical documentation as a strategy, early childhood educators need to communicate with children and families about the learning processes and ensure that all parties can be involved in this process. This requires clear guidelines for the use of pedagogical documentation to ensure that children's rights are respected. Some guidelines and advice we give to you, educators, are as follows. Obtain informed consent from parents or guardians of children before using any images or text of the child in documentation. Use images and/or texts that respect the privacy and dignity of children. Ensure that the documentation is stored securely and confidentially and not shared with unauthorized persons. This involves paying attention to sharing on social networks. Avoid prejudices and stereotypes in documentation. Ensure that the documentation is culturally sensitive and respects diversity. Use documentation only for educational purposes. Follow ethical and scientific principles when conducting educational documentation. Use documentation to support children's learning and development and to inform practices.